At any rate, I'm very glad to be here. I count it an honor to be among you. It's been interesting to see how so many of the papers and the topics have connection points. And today, with my presentation, we'll have another glimpse into what's going on in Baptist life. And my paper focuses more on what's going on right now. And the title is "The Growth of Calvinism Among Southern Baptists in the 21st Century and Its Effect Upon Baptist Church Music." That the landscape of corporate worship among Southern Baptist churches in America has changed drastically in the last 50 years is an inescapable fact. Just as the surrounding secular culture has experienced turmoil and upheaval, many of the long-held worship traditions of all Christian denominations, including Southern Baptist, have come under scrutiny, reform, and in some cases outright rejection. There has been a variety of responses to the sociological and philosophical changes in the secular society. Some churches have adopted an isolationist methodology and have fiercely rejected any type of change in musical style, tradition, or worship practice. Churches on the other end of the spectrum are barely recognizable in comparison to their counterparts merely 25 years ago with respect to musical style, instrumentation, staging, and vocal leadership. Many of the developments within the Southern Baptist life have been primarily reactions to the changes in personal taste, culture, and ideology of the surrounding world. This, however, is not the only agent of change within Southern Baptist churches throughout the past 2 decades. Following the turbulent conservative resurgence of the late 20th century, there's been an increasing shift toward Calvinistic theologies in many of the churches in the Southern Baptist Convention. The rediscovery of the historical heritage of Baptist Calvinists by many churches have forced ministers of music and church musicians to evaluate, change, and renew their worship practices in light of this theological stance. The growing controversy between Calvinist and non-Calvinist is often fraught with exaggeration, stereotype, and a general misunderstanding of the opposing theological and ecclesiastical viewpoints. In order to gain a further understanding of the growing Calvinist resurgence among Southern Baptists, Lifeway Christian Resources and the North American Mission Board recently conducted surveys of Southern Baptist ministers to determine the true breadth of this theological phenomenon. The results of both surveys came to serve as the basis for the recent compilation, Calvinism, a Southern Baptist Dialogue. In that work, Ed Stetzer, president of Lifeway Research, states the following: Calvinism is a growing influence among Southern Baptist leaders, with about 10% affirming the 5 points of Calvinism. However, when we look at recent SBC seminary graduates who now serve as church pastors, nearly 30% of them identify themselves as Calvinist. While it is impossible to ascertain the precise reasons for the growth of Calvinism among Southern Baptist churches, several factors emerge upon further examination. Timothy George sees a connection between the inerrancy controversy and Calvinism. Quote, "Once the question of biblical authority is settled, it becomes urgently important to investigate what the Bible actually teaches about salvation, grace, and election." End quote. One of the most important factors in the adoption of Calvinism among younger Southern Baptist preachers is the widespread popularity of religious leaders such as John Piper, Albert Mohler, John MacArthur, and others. Piper, in particular, exerts tremendous influence through his affiliation with the Passion Conferences geared towards college students. Colin Hansen sees a connection between the Calvinist preaching of John Piper and the popular music emerging from these Passion Conferences. Quote, "Piper lends academic weight, moral authority, and theological precision to the conference. Worship songs from Charlie Hall and Chris Tomlin, preceding talks by Louis Giglio, pound home 2 themes beloved by Calvinists: God's sovereignty and glory. Worship songs from these conferences have come to be among the most widely used songs for corporate worship in American churches, including such songs as How Great Is Our God and Blessed Be Your Name." Defining the terminology. Before any further investigation may be made into the current situation within Southern Baptist churches, it is necessary to define certain terms and the way in which they will be used in this paper. The term Calvinism itself is problematic in that it often immediately provokes an emotional response, yet fails to adequately describe a certain theology or viewpoint. Obviously, the theological position is an outgrowth of the teaching of John Calvin, but while he wrote copious volumes concerning the Scriptures, the church, society, and the Christian life, the term Calvinism itself has a more specific meaning. Tom Askell, executive director of Founders Ministries, elaborates on this distinction between Calvinism and the teachings of John Calvin. Calvin's views on infant baptism, church-state relationship, church officers, and government are rejected outright by many who would nevertheless describe themselves as Calvinists. Calvinism is a worldview. It sees creation, history, and salvation from a God-centered perspective. In particular, Calvinism is used primarily as a soteriological term. It is a shorthand reference for those biblical doctrines that magnify the glory and grace of God in salvation. Another term commonly used to describe this theological position among churches is Reformed. Again, this is problematic in that many denominational traditions stem from the Reformation and are inherently Reformed. This difficulty is accentuated in the fact that the Presbyterian, Dutch Reformed, some Baptist, and other non-denominational traditions identify themselves specifically with this Reformed label. For the purposes of this paper, the term Reformed will be reserved for those faith traditions that describe themselves, that subscribe to the full breadth of the teachings of John Calvin, not simply his soteriology. Doctrines such as pedobaptism, sacramental theology, and church polity are all areas of disagreement between classical Reformed traditions and Southern Baptists. As Malcolm Yarnell notes, these denominations would not be comfortable with terminology such as being born again and evangelical language advocating a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, anecdotally, as we've seen today and yesterday, we've experienced a wide shift in the popularity, if you will, of Calvinism among churches. So as I explore just briefly the historical development of that, note what we've all already heard, and that will serve as supplementary material to this. The historical development of Calvinism among Baptists. In order to understand the current growth of Calvinism among Southern Baptists, it is important to have a basic understanding of the history of Baptist Calvinists. Most scholars identify John Smith's self-baptism and subsequent baptism of several other adults as the genesis of the Baptist tradition. Smith's convictions concerning believers' baptism developed from the Puritan and separatist movements in England during the last half of the 16th century. There is some debate as to the soteriology of these first Baptists, but recent scholarship suggests that they did not identify with Calvinism explicitly. John Briggs notes that the 17th century Baptists were essentially Reformed or Calvinistic Christians who admitted believers on the declaration of their faith in baptism into congregationally ordered churches. Tom Askell again elaborates on the common Calvinist heritage of Baptists by saying, though they did not share the same ecclesiastical goal, Puritans, Separatists, and Independents were all essentially English Calvinists. It is from this common source, perhaps with some influence from continental Anabaptists, that the two streams of Baptists in England originated. One was Arminian and one was Calvinistic. We find then that from their earliest roots, Baptists have been divided over the Calvinist issue. Although the General Baptists were in fact the first Baptist churches in England, their influence began to wane as they drifted away from Arminianism into Unitarianism in the beginning of the 17th century. The particular Baptists continued to grow, and in 1644, 7 particular Baptist churches in London met together and produced what would become known as the First London Confession, which would later serve as the model for several Calvinistic Baptist confessions of faith. Roger Williams is credited with the founding of the first American Baptist Church in Providence, Rhode Island in 1639. Both general and particular Baptists could be found in the colonies in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. But 2 associations of churches, Philadelphia and Charleston, emerged as powerful voices in Baptist life. The particular Baptists, however, quickly became the majority in the American Baptist life, as Philip Thompson states. John Asplin's Annual Register of the Baptist Denomination of 1790 showed that in the late 18th century, of 35 associations in the United States and in frontier territories, 17 formally subscribed to the Westminster Calvinism of the Philadelphia Confession, and 9 more held to the Calvinistic system or Calvinist sentiment. Yet Arminianism among Baptists did not fall away completely, as we've seen already, and with the Great Awakenings of the 17 and 1800s, it found a strong home in the Sandy Creek Association in North Carolina. These separate Baptist churches experienced rapid growth as a result of the revivals in the South and were distinguished by their zeal for evangelism. The Sandy Creek tradition played a large role in the development of the Southern Baptist Convention and shaped much of its later theology. Quote, in particular, the individualism of the American frontier and the separate Baptist revivalistic legacy characterized the methods and eventually the theology of Southern Baptist missions and evangelism. In May 1845, the Southern Baptist Convention came into being as delegates from both particular or regular and separate Baptist churches in the South joined in cooperation. The majority of the historical evidence points to a strong Calvinist sentiment among these first Southern Baptist churches. This Calvinistic leaning is evident in the founding of many of the familiar Southern Baptist entities. David Dockery notes that the early years of the convention, including the founding faculty at Southern Seminary, were largely shaped by this Charleston tradition. A gradual shift away from Calvinism occurred during the first half of the 20th century, led by influential theologians as E.Y. Mullins and W.T. Connor. It is also important not to underestimate the influence of the revivalism of Billy Sunday, Dwight Moody, and Billy Graham. Much of Southern Baptist worship practice bears greater resemblance to this pattern of evangelistic worship service than to more historical Baptistic models. Upon this historical foundation, the current Calvinist resurgence has emerged and has begun to impact Southern Baptist life in dramatic and often controversial ways. Now we move to the present, and the basis of the rest of my paper was a survey that I've conducted over the past summer of churches throughout the South in 9 states, so that's just a little bit of a picture of where I'm going with this. In order to gauge the impact of this Calvinist resurgence among the worship practices of Southern Baptist churches, the author conducted a survey of Southern Baptist churches across 9 states. Group A consists of churches who self-identify with the Founders Ministries, an organization which describes itself as a ministry of teaching and encouragement, promoting both doctrine and devotion expressed in the doctrines of grace and their experiential application to the local church, particularly in the areas of worship and witness. In order to affiliate with Founders Ministries, a church must, at a minimum, have a pastor who is able to subscribe to one of the historic Baptistic confessions, which they identify as the Abstracted Principles, the Second London Baptist Confession of 1689, the First London Baptist Confession of 1644, or the New Hampshire Confession. Although membership in the Southern Baptist Convention is not a requirement for affiliation with the Founders Ministries, the survey was only disseminated to those churches who are members of the Southern Baptist Convention. Group B consists of a random sampling of Southern Baptist churches in the same states as those of Group A. This control group provides the basis for comparison between the worship practices of churches with a distinctive Calvinistic theology and those who make no such distinction. Pastors, ministers of music, and church musicians of various churches in both groups were contacted via email and invited to participate in the survey. The surveys were available online for completion for a period of 4 weeks, and the anonymous submissions were then compiled and separated and analyzed by group. The survey instrument itself is divided into 3 primary sections. Number 1, basic church demographic information. Number 2, general worship service related questions. And number 3, general music related questions. Basic church demographic information. In the first section of questions, the participants provided essential information concerning the church location, average Sunday morning worship attendance, community type, and average congregational age range. Group A consisted of 35 churches in 7 different states, whereas Group B consisted of 20 churches in 4 states. As we'll see from the first slide here, Group A, once again, just as a reminder, would be your Calvinistic churches. Group B would be your non-Calvinistic churches. This chart details the average Sunday morning worship attendance for churches in both groups. The fact that the majority of the churches in Group A consisted of congregations with less than 500 members in weekly worship attendance provides important insight concerning their musical and worship practices. Churches in Group B may simply have more access to resources, both personnel and financial, than their counterparts in Group A, and therefore their corporate worship services might feature different elements. While the majority of the responses in both groups indicated that their churches were in suburban settings, 25% of the responses in Group A indicated a rural setting, whereas none of the respondents in Group B indicated a rural setting. Again, this provides another layer of interpretation as we analyze the data. Moving on to general worship service questions. In the second section of the survey instrument, respondents encountered questions concerning the various musical and non-musical elements of their worship services. These questions were chosen specifically to gauge the usage of worship elements traditionally found in Reformed traditions, such as corporate confession of sin and the reassurance of forgiveness, the usage of public confessions of faith, corporate reading of Scripture, and the usage of the doxology in worship. Other questions included the frequency of the celebration of the Lord's Supper, the presence of altar calls or a time of invitation for non-believers, and the involvement of pastoral leadership in worship planning. Our next slide shows us the frequency that these churches indicated that their congregation read Scripture in their worship services. Several surprising results arose from the analysis of the data collected. First, churches in Group A placed a higher emphasis on the public reading of Scripture by their congregation than did those in Group B. 97% of those churches in Group A indicated they read Scripture publicly in worship versus 80%. Now this chart only shows us those churches who indicated that they did read Scripture publicly. As we see in Group A, 91% of those churches who read Scripture publicly in worship do it weekly, whereas only 45% of those in Group B do that. Secondly, times of corporate confession and the reassurance of the forgiveness of sins were found more frequently in churches in Group A, 57%, than in Group B, 35%. Group A churches were also more likely to use public confessional statements of faith in worship, 49%, than churches in Group B, 30%. These results are consistent with the expectation that the worship practices of Group A would more closely correspond with the traditional Reformed worship practices. Just a side note, in the paper that goes online, I will include all the statistical data so you can look at this later. I just didn't want to overwhelm you with numbers and percentages. So, one area in which the Calvinist theology of Group A is evident is found in the responses to the question, does your church have a time in which non-believers can make public professions of faith? As we see, 37% of the churches in Group A responded no, while 85% of the churches in Group B answered yes. The issue of altar calls and evangelism and worship is one of the areas of sharpest disagreements between Calvinist and non-Calvinist among Baptist churches. Those churches in which the freedom of the human will and its role in salvation is emphasized exhibit a much higher likelihood to extend an invitation to come to faith during a corporate worship service. Lastly, the influence of the pastor over the worship and musical design of his corporate worship service is greater in churches from Group A than Group B. 60% of the responses in Group A indicated that the senior pastor was involved in some way with the worship planning. And in fact, 29% of those churches indicated the senior pastor was solely responsible for music selection and worship design. Only 35% of their pastoral counterparts in Group B were involved in the worship planning, and as we can see, all of those were in conjunction with the ministers of music and other church musicians. So from this data, we see that the pastors of these churches have a much greater influence over what is sung and what materials and elements are used in their corporate worship services.